Welcome. Well, welcome back for those of you that attended this morning, and welcome for those of you that are just doing the afternoon session. And we had a fantastic morning. I guess we should probably recap what we covered. We had a brilliant talk from Mandeep Semi, who is a wheelchair basketball player, and shared some really useful insights into his experience in the workplace and what the work he does in schools. We also had some impact stories from our citizens and our supporters, so they were really useful, and we're going to have a couple more of those this afternoon. And we also had some discussions as well around what you need to do as a supporter and what you can do as a citizen. So we're going to continue much of that this afternoon, and people are still popping in actually, so we will give people a couple more minutes. We are going to be putting you to breakout rooms as well later, so hopefully you all know what group you're going to be in, but we'll talk about that nearer the time. So let us start with our next speaker. So our next speaker is from Wolverhampton University Sport, and he's going to share with us another one of our supporter impact stories. So over to you, Lee Hardwick.
Hi everyone. My name's Lee Hardwick. I've worked at the university now for about eight years, across different roles. But first got involved in Include Me, West Midlands, around August 2019, and that was our sort of the start of our journey. A month later or so, we started to formalise our initial change plan. And we identified principles that we related to, what our strengths were, what our weaknesses were. And we realised that we needed help with sort of the principles that related to my locality, my values, listen to me and welcome me. And from that, later, a couple of months later, we identified 3 aims to focus on. First of these was developing the plan of how we can gain feedback from our users in an inclusive manner. We do have a model of gaining feedback, but we didn't necessarily promote this or regularly engage with our customers to ask for feedback. The second one was to develop an online inclusive service, which made it easier for customers to interact with our services and offers. And the third one was to develop a document for the organisation and across the department that outlines our minimum standards for communication. So following that, started to create an inclusive communications document for staff, attended training through Activity Alliance and using different online resources. And we started really piecing it together. And then COVID struck, unfortunately, and a number of our staff got furloughed, and it pretty much put a dent in our work that was going on. So while that was going on, we started to configure our own WLV Sports app. And through the app, we promoted a range of virtual offers. So we had live exercise classes, recorded live challenges, and also put on video tutorials, one of which had a sort of inclusive feel to it. So it is seated exercises and exercises that you could pretty much do anywhere, any place, anytime with minimal equipment. And this time our actual sports facilities was closed for 4 months. And as I suggested earlier, a lot of our staff were furloughed for over 4 months. And then that brought us to August 2020. Sports centres started reopening a little bit. Our services have slowly started to come back. And that meant that we continued actually delivering the virtual offer as well. A few months later, because as you can imagine, through the chaos of COVID, there were several delays with the app. We actually launched our app in May 2021, and this meant that going back to the earlier objective of when we identified the three objectives that we wanted to achieve, our online service was now live, and we could keep that going. We've also kept our virtual offers going, so our live classes. We've kept the video tutorials of different exercises on the app so that our users, as they've rejoined the gym and they're using the gym, they've also got access to resources that they can do anywhere and anytime. We've also then had a successful bid for funding from Sport England and Books, which is the national governing body for university sport. And that has allowed us to develop another digital platform to deliver virtual physical challenges and rewards. So every time a participant participates in a challenge, they can redeem reward points or be entered into prize draws, and that just boosts engagement. But throughout the different challenges, being involved in Include Me has reminded us to keep our challenges very inclusive, and that we're including a range of different measures, different formats, so that there is really something for everybody. We've got really good news to share that our project has now been extended until March next year, and that will again give us a really good platform to be inclusive and to reach out to different audiences and keep ranges of people involved, because we know that there is still barriers to people going into sports and exercise clubs and participating in sport. So that is something that is ongoing. And some of my colleagues who might be on the call at the moment have started to formalise some inclusive framework around the academic side of the university. So we all sit within one department at the university, and we've got a leisure facility which caters for the community, but we also have the academic department, which is mainly aimed at students and pushing them out into the community. So a couple of my colleagues are leading on the inclusive framework, but it's a joined up approach, and hopefully it's something that then can be shared wider across the university. But by implementing it with our students, when they graduate, they will then be able to go out and implement it across the community as well. So that sort of quickly tells you about our journey that we've been on as an Include Me supporter. But one of the things I really wanted to get across today was the value of being an Include Me supporter. And it is about being a part of a network of like-minded people who want to drive engagement and reduce barriers for people across a range of different services, not just exercise and sport. And that brings me to mention the service that up until 12 months ago, I didn't know anything about, and that was Welcome Me, which is a web-based app. And it is around engaging the customer and making sure that the customer's first experience in a range of different settings is phenomenal, and they're not going to be turned away because of a poor experience. But additionally to that, as I've already mentioned, the additional training that's involved, these type of workshops and conferences, again, networking with like-minded people, having those conversations, you're able to learn a lot more from people and then include it within different areas of work. I know that I've quickly just sort of thrown everything out there, but I'm happy to take any questions if you've got time, or for my contact details to be shared so that people can get in touch afterwards and ask us about what other things that we've been doing, and in particular the online offer, virtual offer as well.
Thanks, Lee. I mean, if people can put their questions in the chat and definitely put your contact details in there and continue that conversation. And it's just great to hear that the university is doing such a great job, both from the sort of sport and physical activity side, but also from an academic point. And, you know, you also mentioned the impact that COVID had, and we are going to be hearing later as well about the impact of COVID and how it's treated people differently. So next, we're going to just have a health of the region video. So watch this and we'll speak to you in a moment.
It's my privilege to introduce our Health of the Region report. A really important report because it shines a very sharp light on the health inequalities that exist across the region. And regrettably, COVID-19 has actually exposed those inequalities and has deepened them.
Health inequalities are a real issue within the West Midlands. Inequalities relate to where we live, how we live our lives, and also access to a range of services to support our health. Preventable causes such as cardiovascular disease, respiratory conditions, liver disease, cancer, as well as infant mortality rates have been much higher. We've also had higher rates of drinking, obesity, and physical inactivities, as well as people not taking up the opportunity for cancer screening. But this is all in the backdrop of the greater levels of deprivation in the West Midlands.
So there are a number of things that are happening that means that Black and minority ethnic people are more likely to contract the disease and to die from the disease. The first thing is that Black and minority ethnic people are more likely to have jobs and roles, which mean that they're on the front line. The second thing that's happening is that you're more likely to live in areas where you're deprived, more likely to have more people living in the same house. We also need to recognise how issues of racism impact on communities as well.
What the pandemic has highlighted is the amazing call to action from our diverse faith communities. Places of worship came together to prepare food and serve food together. We saw clothes banks as well as the food banks growing and developing in the region. The role of communities for action on health inequalities is very important.
We've identified 4 key challenge areas that the combined authority and our regional partners have come up with more than 50 commitments to address these. The first challenge is around improving outcomes for our Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. Our second challenge is around tackling the wider determinants of health. This means getting a good start in life, educational attainment, our jobs and income, our homes and where we live, and the friendships and the sense of purpose we all require. The third challenge area is around widening access to health and care. Fourth challenge is around people-powered health. By people-powered health, we mean people more involved in their health and care.
So the first recommendation, we would want the government to work with partners to take action on race disparities and associated risk factors. Secondly, the government should double the proportion of health and social care spending to focus on prevention and public health. And then the third recommendation, again, the government should do all it can to close the gap in primary care provision between the most and the least deprived neighbourhoods. And then the fourth recommendation, government should invest in the West Midlands Combined Authority's Radical Health Prevention Fund. We do need to take steps to ensure a happier, healthier, more resilient population to future pandemics.
Let us make sure that this event does not pass without us really leaning in to some of the underlying issues.
Well, a very impactful video, some staggering statistics in there, and at least we've identified some key areas that we can start to address, and hopefully that we'll start to see the differences of that very soon. So next we're going to hear from another speaker, and our next speaker is here in the Inclusion and Wellbeing Officer at West Midlands Combined Authority, and he's going to introduce us to a topic that maybe some of you don't know anything about, and it's called microaggressions. So can I please welcome Louise Bown?
Yeah, thank you, Darren. So what I'll do quickly then is I will share my screen, and hopefully you'll be able to see my my presentation. So if I just share that, and then I will start. Here we go. So can I just quickly confirm that you can see the presentation?
It's in your presenter view rather than in the presentation.
Oh, right. Sorry about this. I probably should have tested this earlier.
No worries.
So, if I go on to... Right. Oh, here we go. Hold on. So sorry about this. I've never been a co-host on this before, so it is a bit tricky to see.
So as while you're doing that, how many people were here this morning, and how many are new to the session? Perhaps you could, if you didn't attend this morning, can you raise your hands using the electronic hand? Then we just see how many new people we've got. There we go. We've got a couple.
Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah, I can see. Oh, thank you. So I have shared my screen again. Can you see the actual presentation, or is it still presenter view?
Still in presenter view.
Oh my days.
Louise, if you come out of that and then click the book looking icon towards the bottom right of the screen, if you come out of that view.
I come out of it.
Welcome, Sarah. Welcome, Charlotte. Welcome, Kate.
Right. Can you see that now?
Perfect.
Oh, brilliant.
Perfect.
Thank you so
There we
much
go.
for bearing with me on this. Okay, so
Thanks to you.
awesome. So microaggressions. So what I really wanted to do today was to kind of give a bit of an introduction into what microaggressions are. So I am aware that microaggressions may be a word that is quite new to you. So I was thinking, if we go off the actual word microaggressions itself, and we start to think about what does it mean to you, or what do you think it means? Now, I personally find microaggressions to be quite an interesting word, because if we break it down into the words micro and aggression, they're kind of opposite. So the term micro, you think of something small and tiny, but actually with aggression, you think of something quite big and angry. So when we combine the two to make microaggression, it's quite interesting, because you think of something that's small but also quite big and impactful, and that in a nutshell is what microaggressions are. So it's something small, but it can have quite a big impact. So if I go on to the official definition of microaggressions, so microaggressions are brief, indirect, subtle and commonplace verbal or behavioural discrimination. They're often unintentional, but can have a potentially harmful or unpleasant psychological impact on the affected individual or group. And they can be in the form of statements, actions, or by being excluded. And also they cut across all social identities. So everyone, no matter what our social identity is, so whether we are male, female, whether we are disabled, whether we are black, white, anything, we can still be susceptible to being on the receiving end of a microaggression. So taking this into consideration, I kind of want us to start to think about, do we think, based off of that definition, if we've been on the receiving end of what a microaggression is? And I do feel like that definition can be a little bit complex. So what I did is I found quite a good video that I think sums up the term microaggression quite well. So if I change this screen to... if I can just play this video, and if you just confirm that you can hear it, that would be brilliant. So typical, isn't it? Suddenly Zoom just does not want to be my friend. So what I will do is I will go onto YouTube, and I have got this up as a actual YouTube page. So hopefully that is a little bit easier for everyone to understand. and to C. It will also give me the opportunity to make it a bit bigger as well, which is quite good because on the actual presentation, it was in a small screen. So I will play this for you now.
For people who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem,
Oh, you're so well spoken.
just imagine, instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
Ugh, it's a compliment.
Mosquito bites and their itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while,
No, where are you really from?
Cleveland?
sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date,
Oh, your English is so good.
Excuse me?
going grocery shopping,
You know, everything happens for a reason.
I'm just buying apples.
commuting to work,
So when are you gonna have a baby?
watching TV,
We have to keep the Redskins name. It's part of our culture and history.
or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up everywhere.
Do you know John? Give me shopping advice. I love shared.
Of course, beyond just being annoying, some mosquitoes carry truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life for years.
Astrophysics? Maybe you should try less challenging, Major.
Ow, my dreams.
And other mosquitoes carry strains that can even kill you.
He looked like he was up to trouble, okay? I felt threatened.
So next time you think someone's overreacting, just remember, some people experience mosquito bites all the time.
You're all so exotic. Wow.
And by mosquito bites, we mean microaggressions.
So that was just the clip that I shared. Can I just confirm that that was all okay and that everybody understood that all right? Is there any questions?
Yeah, it's perfect. Thank you.
Brilliant. So if there's any questions based off of that, feel free to ask away in the chat box. That's completely fine. So what that video was essentially a behavioural example of microaggressions. And so hopefully it gives you a little bit of an example of how it can be in real terms, how we can experience them. But there are also, as we mentioned previously, behavioural and environmental examples of microaggressions. So some examples that I put together here. So a behavioural example could be ignoring someone, using negative or dismissive body language. So a dismissive facial expression, that's quite a good example of a behavioural microaggression. Someone may be a little bit hostile or a little bit unfriendly towards somebody for certain identifications that they have. So for example, they could be black or disabled, or male, female, or of a certain religion. And then also touching someone without permission, and that's quite a common example that when we speak to people from the black community around touching their hair in particular, that's quite a common microaggression. Similarly, if some Muslim women wear headscarves, some people may go up and touch that and think that that's okay, but actually that is an example of a microaggression, because if we think about it, if somebody has that happen to them, they may feel like they don't fit in. They may feel like they're a little bit different and they're not normal, even though there isn't an actual definition of what normal is. And it can make them feel a little bit like an outsider. And if you imagine somebody has that happen to them every day by different people, you can begin to understand how, even though it is a small thing in the grand scheme of things, having that happen a lot of the time is actually quite big, and that's a big impact that it can have, which again I suppose sums up the word microaggression. Even though it may seem small, if we look at these different layers and they all kind of build up on each other, it can actually have a very big impact. And same with the environmental side of things. So for example, only having white people in promotional literature. So I was speaking to Mark yesterday actually around how there's a lot of psychological studies that have gone into the representation of different ethnicities amongst children. So typically, when you're little, you can walk into a toy shop and you may see that there's lots of different dolls and different, baby dolls, for example. And one thing that I noticed growing up, and that I'm more aware of now because I'm more aware of microaggressions, is the fact that they were all white children. They were all white dolls. They were all white baby dolls. All the Barbies were very skinny and very slim. There's no different kind of color in terms of their skin tone or even their hair color or even their body shape. And children that grow up seeing that, they don't necessarily see themselves. Or when you look through a magazine, for example, you can see that it's all stereotypically white people that are there. Or if there's kind of when I was growing up, I'd pick up, Girl Talk magazines. That was one that I had, and it would have a little Q&A and a section on how to do your hair. And little sections like that, they would be tailored to Caucasian hair, so my hair, European hair, but you'd never see anything around Afro-Caribbean hair. And that in itself is a microaggression, because if you imagine if you're growing up and you see that every day as if you were a young, black child, for example, you don't see yourself, and then you internalize that. And again, even though that is something quite small, it does have a big growing impact. And then also things like not having wheelchair access to a building or not having closed captions. It's not very inclusive, and it prevents a lot of people from accessing different things. And even though, again, in the grand scheme of things, people may not think having, a different entrance to a building is really a big deal, but actually we're all aware that there are wheelchair users out there, and if they don't have that accessibility in order to get to a building, they don't have, opportunities to go for jobs in that building, or even go to pick up a coffee if it's a coffee shop, for example. And it's those little things where it may seem quite small, it's just a set of stairs, of course people can use stairs, but actually people can't. And that again is where the microaggression terms come from, because it can be something quite small to, the normal, as I mentioned earlier, but it really isn't. And if you face those little things every day, again, we can start to see the different layers. So again, that's another example of an environmental microaggression. And I hope that the video and sort of discussing through these has kind of made you think a little bit around how things can be excluding of others. So based on that, I just kind of, and the things that I've spoken about, one thing that I'm really keen in sort of getting you guys to think about, and generally, is around, would you challenge a microaggression you received? Would you challenge one that you witnessed as well? So whilst we may think of examples that we've been on the receiving end of, if somebody else was on the receiving end of a microaggression, would we feel comfortable in speaking about that? And then also, would we actually acknowledge a microaggression that we've committed? So I know for definite that I am not innocent in that. I've definitely committed some microaggressions in my time. And I think a lot of people do, because as we mentioned earlier, it often is unintentional, and there often is no kind of negative thinking behind it. But it can still potentially have a negative impact on somebody on the receiving end. And that's kind of the importance of understanding that, what microaggressions are and the meaning behind those behaviors, and things like that. Because personally, before I learned about microaggressions, and say if I was on the receiving end of one, I would kind of not really think about it because it's small, but at the same time it still hurts me a little bit. And it's really about that awareness, and I hope that through discussing microaggressions previously, that we kind of now get to think about it a little bit more. But in terms of, so if we was to challenge a microaggression you received, I think my advice would be that first of all, you need to feel comfortable and safe, because sometimes it can be a little bit scary. If you've been on the receiving end of something, you may kind of think, oh, that doesn't feel very nice, I'll just kind of walk away, which is completely okay, and you're completely allowed to feel that way. But if you wanted to kind of speak up and educate that person, because they may not be aware that it was hurtful, we'd want to feel safe and comfortable, and also be quite calm, because then it allows a conversation to happen, and then that in itself is educational, because you can potentially help someone realize that something that they do without thinking about it may actually have a negative impact on somebody else, and by them being aware of it, they'll then stop that. um, which again is something that we just hope to achieve by challenging microaggressions. There's no kind of anger around it. It's very much about an educational conversation. Um, but also it's important when, if you do challenge a microaggression, that it's about sharing your feelings rather than actually attacking that person. And that's why it's quite important to speak calmly, because we don't want anybody to think that we're kind of, so for example, if somebody says something that could be seen as homophobic or, you know, sexist, and they may not think of it as that way, we wouldn't want them to kind of, if we ran up to them and said, oh, you're homophobic, they'd kind of close off and they'd get quite angry, when it's more about addressing the behavior rather than the person. So the person, just because they say something and they may not realize it's hurtful, may not understand, and they may not, you know, they may not be homophobic or racist at all, but something that they have said or a behavior that they've shown can be interpreted that way, which in itself can be damaging. It's about addressing that behavior rather than kind of labeling that person, because then by doing it that way, it does open more of a conversation, and then it avoids the likelihood of conflict as well, which is something that we don't want to happen. Because when conflict happens, people then run away and they don't want to listen to what you've got to say, which again is counterproductive, because that's really not what we're trying to do. But one thing I also think is important is that you stay within your comfort zone. So at any point, if you feel like at one point, if you feel like you're capable of challenging a microaggression that you receive or witness, you can start that conversation. And then at any point, if it feels a little bit uncomfortable, or you don't, or if it's going in kind of a way that you don't really want it to, then you are well within your right to kind of say, okay, you know, maybe we can talk about this another time, and then walk away and step away. You're trying to kind of help them by making sure they're aware of, you know, some things that may be upsetting, but at the same time, it's not your responsibility to educate that person. It's only if you feel comfortable enough to do that. And especially if you have been on the receiving end, it can be quite an emotional, I suppose, experience to receive that. So especially if you've been on the receiving end, you don't need to challenge that at all. You could potentially walk away and think, okay, I'll probably talk to this person again at a later time, or you may not choose to do it at all. And instead, you know, definitely we would recommend that you go and talk to a friend, and just talk about, you know, what you've experienced, and just say how it made you feel, to help you process what has happened, because it can be very very upsetting and disheartening if you are on the receiving end of a microaggression. So it is important to make sure that you deal with that in in the correct way, so you feel, you know, well enough and good enough within yourself to kind of continue and not let that hold you back at all. Oh, Mark's just asked if I want to unshare my screen, and yeah, I'm more than happy to. I'll just kind of carry on as a bit of a conversation. So in terms of a microaggression that you've witnessed, it's kind of similar in the sense of you want to speak calmly and speak comfortably. But in terms of witnessing a microaggression, it's important to remember that you're not necessarily speaking to the person that has received that microaggression. So somebody could receive a microaggression or something that you would interpret as a microaggression, and they might think, okay, and just carry on about their day. Whereas us as an active bystander, we may think, actually, do you know what, that wasn't very nice. I think, you know, it would be good for that person to be made aware of the fact that it may be a little bit upsetting what they just said. And that's from our perspective, as opposed to the person on the receiving end of that microaggression. So in terms of challenging a microaggression that we witness, it's quite important that people are aware of the fact that we're speaking on our own behalf as opposed to the person who was receiving that behavior. And it can still very much be an educational conversation, because that can make that person who said something or did something think and realize, oh, okay, that may be upsetting. Thank you for telling me. I won't do that again. And that in itself is the importance, I think, of being an active bystander, because what I mentioned previously in terms of, especially if you're on the receiving end of a microaggression, it can be quite upsetting to suddenly then feel like you need to respond or challenge. And that's definitely the role of an active bystander, in the sense of we're hoping to kind of step in and prevent something else from happening again, on, I suppose, not necessarily on behalf of the person who received it, but on behalf of the greater good and society. Because generally, if certain behaviours don't go addressed, then people are going to think that it's okay to carry on acting a certain way. And that very well could be because of the fact that the person who is normally on the receiving end of that behaviour doesn't feel like they can speak up. And in that sense, it's quite important that as witnesses, that we kind of, as long as we feel comfortable, that we also step up and challenge, because it's very much a joint collaborative approach that we all need to take, in the sense of you shouldn't just have to be on the receiving end of something to challenge. And it's by all of us coming together and acknowledging that certain behaviours aren't okay, that we then educate and create a wider cultural change as well. So that's, I suppose, in terms of challenging one that you witness or receive. But I think it is also very important that we acknowledge a microaggression that we commit ourselves. And that is very much a part of the educational process as well, about learning about microaggressions and these kind of behaviors and comments and environmental microaggressions as well, that we then become aware of potentially our previous behaviors. And I think it's important that we take responsibility of our own actions. And if we may potentially say something in the moment, and then upon reflection, we may think, oh, I maybe shouldn't have said that. I want to check that that person's okay. We can then feedback and kind of listen. And it's quite important that if somebody does challenge us as well, that we avoid becoming defensive, because like I said previously, people can become quite cut off if they feel like they're being attacked on a personal level. So it's quite important to avoid being defensive and to actually listen. And also, I think, as we mentioned previously, a lot of these microaggressions are completely unintentional, and we mean no harm by saying things. They could be certain things that are just part of society's phrases and not really think about them. And as long as somebody on the receiving end is aware that you didn't mean to upset them or cause them any harm, but also that you understand how the behaviour may have impacted them, that in itself then kind of opens up more people to feel confident about challenging other microaggressions as well. So we all, I suppose, have our role to play, and I really hope that my kind of quick whistle stop tour has kind of helped you understand a little bit more around microaggressions. But I am aware that luckily we'll be going into a panel pretty much now, to learn a little bit more about individual experiences, hopefully. So I hope that was okay. Apologies for the technical difficulties early on as well. I've never shared a slide on Zoom before, as you can probably tell.
Thanks, Lisa. Simon, can we take your question later if you can?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I didn't realise there's a panel discussion where we could actually raise it. So that was the thing I wanted to do, because it's too long-winded to write.
Beautiful. Okay.
War and Peace. So thank you.
So Lisa, you're going to be hosting the panel. So do you want to introduce the people on the panel, or do you want me to do it? Have you got the names?
Yeah, so thank you, Darren. So I believe on our panel today, we've got yourself, Darren Harris, and we've also got Jenny Drew here. So Jenny works in WMCA, and then Alex Giles, who's here from Activity Alliance, and then we've also got Lucy Keeling, who I believe is the EDI lead at Aston Villa, which is exciting. So yeah, if you're happy for me to kick off, Darren, and I'll ask away if that's okay.
Go for it.
Brilliant. So first of all, thank you everyone for obviously listening to the presentation. And I think if we kind of continue the conversation on from there, really, First of all, what I'd like to open up to the panel is, would you feel comfortable to share any personal experiences that you have of microaggressions, but how, if you're happy to share examples, how it made you feel, and whether kind of you think upon reflection, learning a little bit more about microaggressions and taking that knowledge, can you see in hindsight that it is quite common within your kind of lives, I suppose?
Who do you want to start with?
Darren,
Are you picking on me? Okay, so I mean, it's one of those things where I probably wouldn't have given it the name microaggression because I didn't really know what that was until you kind of spoke about it. But I mean, I had one literally a couple of days ago where I was on the train traveling out to Hensford, which is a funny place if any of you guys know it, and I was not concentrating. I was on my phone and I missed my stop at Hensford. So the next stop is Rugeley Town. So I've never been to Rugeley Town as a train station. So I got off the train and obviously I need to cross over to the other side of the platform. And because it's a station I didn't know how to get over. So I heard someone walking nearby me and I just said to them, well, can you tell me how to get over to the other side? And they kind of sort of sniggered and laughed and said, well, over the bridge, obviously. Now, I guess that would be an example of a microaggression. Now, she didn't see that I had a cane, so I kind of made some sarcastic remark and pointed at it. And then actually, she was really, really helpful after that. But I suppose I suppose it's all of us being mindful of that. When someone asks a question or someone says something, then there's usually a reason why they're asking that question. And it's probably, even if the answer seems obvious to you, perhaps it's taking that extra second or two to think, well, maybe why are they asking this question if it's so obvious?
No, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. And I think, interestingly, if you hadn't have, I suppose, like you mentioned, sarcastically pointed at your cane, that woman may not have been aware of the fact that, what she said was potentially offensive in a way and can, have an impact. And that in itself would have, I suppose, shut down that conversation. But you actually sort of, I suppose, educated them a little bit, which is very good to hear. So I suppose in your own way you did challenge without verbally challenging, and I think that's also something that we may need to take on board as well, is that you don't need to be verbal in how you challenge. It could be behavioural as well, which is very interesting. Thank you. Jenny, would you be happy to share any contributions at all?
Yeah, thanks for the previous example. It was really helpful to hear that. And I guess I was thinking generally, after seeing your overview, which is great, thanks. I think the value of talking about microaggressions is it giving a framework and a language for talking about difficulties in as non-judgmental a way as possible. So working from the starting point that we can all make mistakes, consciously or unconsciously. And from my perspective, life's generally better, easier when we can acknowledge those. And I think having that, the framework of microaggressions, it can depersonalize talking about the impact of them, while obviously there's still very much a personal impact. And some examples of the ones that have stayed with me most have been, so my son is autistic and has type 1 diabetes. So we spent a lot of time in different healthcare settings, and there have been various instances where I'm generally called mom rather than kind of my name acknowledged when it's about me. But in terms of my son's experience, and generally I kind of pick and choose when to talk about his needs, because I'm conscious that they're his, and especially as he's getting older, for him to share or not. But a number of instances where people have challenged, kind of, well, doesn't look that autistic, or what do you expect it to look like? Or I'm seeing things that he does and likes to do. Oh wow, so how great, that you're still doing that. But that you can do that, you know, despite everything. And yeah, they're certainly ones that have struck me, and also in terms of my own experience of mental health difficulties, and being disabled by those frequently. The working through asking for adjustments that aren't necessarily obvious. So, you know, talking about trying to avoid early morning meetings, for example, because, yeah, they can be really difficult due to sleep difficulties. So, yeah, there's some examples that I'd share.
No, thank you, Jenny. Thank you, I suppose, as well for feeling like you can share that. Because, like you mentioned, you're very mindful of the fact that your experiences, and that you're quite reserved in terms of what you share and where. So it's very nice to kind of, as us as viewers, to hear that. So thank you very much. Alex, are you comfortable to share anything at all?
Yeah, thank you, Louise. I think there's a couple for me that sort of jump out as well. The one would be sort of when growing up, really, I used to always find, you know, being a sort of a teenager and young adult, that often the people I was with, if somebody would come up to me in the street or kind of to talk to me, they would always talk to that person first rather than talk to me. So they would communicate with the person who was with me rather than me. So I think that's probably the one that stuck out to me most. And I kind of always found myself, to start with, I used to just wait until they'd finished speaking, and then I'd end up just saying, actually, I'm able to converse back with you with the answer that you need. So I suppose that would be a common one that sort of came up for me as well. And then recently, sort of in the last sort of 6 months, I had a taxi, unfortunately, once that wouldn't take me anywhere because they hadn't got the right ramp to put my chair in the taxi, because they'd only got the ones where it's the ones that you space out rather than the solid ramp, and unfortunately my chair doesn't go up that ramp. So again, that was a difficult challenge of not being able to be able to get to where I needed to right for that actual second. So yeah, so they'd be the two that would jump out, but I'm sure everybody's experienced those kind of things to varying degrees.
No,
Thank you.
thank you. Thanks for sharing that, Alex. And I genuinely feel like you're not alone in that experience. And I think that is all too common. And I think that's the interesting thing about microaggressions, because that can then label that behavior.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of just another example of all these examples. And when you put them all together, you just realize that isn't okay. And I think, you know, it comes across, I mean, similarly for me, it's in a different way, I suppose. Between me and my partner always gets addressed because he's a male and I'm the female. And it's quite interesting because even though stereotypically people think of males as being, you know, the leader of the household and kind of the one that kind of takes charge, even though interestingly, within this household, I earn more than my partner. So if you think about it in that way, it's quite interesting because I provide in a roundabout way a little bit more to the household. So it's interesting for people and that behaviour to be on the receiving end. And it's unfortunate because it cuts across all different social identificators, like we said previously. And I think hopefully by having this discussion now, and you sharing your experiences as well, Alex, around people speaking over you or for you, we can then think about ways that we can resolve that. And I think that's the powerful thing about the term microaggression, because it brings all of these things together, whereas normally we think about them as individual behaviours. When we bring them all together, we can see actually this is a very big problem. So thanks again for sharing. Lucy, are you comfortable to share anything at all?
Yeah, thanks, Louise. So I was thinking as everyone was talking, you know, have I got a specific example? And I think as a white, you know, non-disabled person, I'm probably less likely, but also as a woman working in football, there's probably been a lot that I haven't even noticed or picked up on at the time. And it's probably only kind of looking back, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, before I was even aware of what microaggressions were, that, oh, actually, yeah, that could have been a little dig, or that could have been well-meaning, but, you know, affected me in a certain way. But it is a topic that interests me massively in terms of culture and workplace culture, and how you know, those subtleties can have a kind of far-reaching impact on an individual. And I think working at a football club, which is still very male-dominated, I think what we see is a slight gendering of roles potentially, and that these microaggressions may come out in terms of stereotypes, or, you know, assuming someone does a specific role, or if you're a woman working in the academy, then you might not be a coach, you're probably a medical staff, or, you know, something like that. So I think they can come out through stereotypes. But the other thing that I wanted to bring to your awareness, if you're interested in this, sorry, Amazon, there's a really great book. It's called Subtle Acts of Exclusion. So instead of calling it microaggressions, they called it subtle acts of exclusion. And I think every time that there is a microaggression, you are excluded from that situation, whether you pick up on it at the time or not.
No, definitely. Thank you for that. I'll drop that in the chat box, actually, that book shortly. I did just want to rectify. So earlier when I introduced Lucy, I did say EDI lead, and by EDI I mean equality, diversity and inclusion lead. So that's just something that I wanted to apologize for earlier. Being in the corporate world, it's something that acronyms are a bit of a pain sometimes, and we kind of just say them sometimes. So sorry about that. But interestingly, Lucy, if you're happy for me to kind of ask about this, so working, like you mentioned, within a male-dominated football club in particular, is there anything as a workforce that I suppose you acknowledge, or anything that you have in place to kind of try and combat microaggressions or kind of break down those stereotypes? Or is there anything that you would recommend that as workplaces that are on the call now, we kind of take on board?
I think it's a long journey, and it's one that I think we're now aware of, because of various commitments that we've got through the Premier League and through the FA, around equitable recruitment and things like that. But I would say, I think everything starts with policy. So we've recently reviewed all of our policies and ensured that we're kind of referencing inclusion and belonging. But, you know, policy is one thing. I think it's around making people aware of their own bias, their own judgments that we all have as human beings, and creating maybe a safe space to discuss those within learning and development. So that would probably be the next step for us, would be to have meetings or training development around how we can safely challenge things, you know, and how actually by challenging things in the right way, it will benefit us and the organisation.
No, definitely. Thank you. Thanks for that. I mean, you mentioned safe space as well. And I think one thing that I wanted to echo to everybody who's on the call at the moment is that I very much want you to feel like this is a safe space for you to contribute, whether it's within this discussion around microaggressions or at any point throughout the remainder of this session. And I really hope that you have felt that throughout, obviously, this morning as well. So I think there is a lot of power in safe spaces and being able to voice things without judgment and feeling safe as well, which is very important. Thank you for that, Lucy. I think one thing that I wanted to ask the panel as well is around, I suppose, being an active bystander, because like, as I mentioned previously, it can be a little bit difficult to challenge if you're on the receiving end, and whether you feel that in some instances you would feel comfortable, or what do you feel would kind of encourage confidence for people to challenge? Would you have kind of any tips, or how would you approach it personally? That's something that I would be quite interested to gauge from the panel, if you'd be happy to. So rather than necessarily being on the receiving end, actually witnessing that. So if we go in the same order, Darren, are you okay?
Yeah, I've got an example of a conference. I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and there was a transgender woman, and who I was speaking to with a group of others, and I kept referring to her using the male pronoun, and I kept forgetting that she was a woman, and she got very aggressive about it. But from my perspective, my only identifiers that she was a woman, well, my only identifiers that I would use to pick someone's gender would be their voice, for example. I couldn't see what she was wearing or anything like that. So it became quite a heated discussion, because I think she felt that I was doing it deliberately when I wasn't. Yeah, it got quite difficult, and she got very aggressive with me. But I did stand up for myself, because I felt, here we are, where you're trying to encourage everyone to be more tolerant, but actually showing no tolerance towards me, when I've made an innocent mistake in that situation.
No, that's a really interesting story to share as well, actually, because that's, I suppose, an example of the intersectionalities crossing as well, because like you didn't intend to cause any kind of malice at all, and as you mentioned, an identifier for you would be the tone of somebody's voice, which is completely valid. And it's interesting the fact that a speaker who promotes inclusion arguably didn't really understand the inclusive element of actually having that kind of educational conversation with yourself. And you know, I think that's, thank you for sharing that story, first of all, because that's given me a lot of food for thought as well. As long as the panel is okay, I have noticed that some people have raised their hands. If you'd be happy for us to go to those who have raised their hands and then jump back to that kind of train of thought, if we have time, if that's okay. I do want to make sure that everyone feels like they have contributed, including the people that have raised their hands, if that's okay. I'm going to take that as a yes.
Yes. Simon's had his hand up for ages.
Yeah, I know, Simon. I'm so sorry. Do you want to jump in?
Honestly, don't worry. I think Shada was before me, though, and I don't want to. Using the terms of intersectionality, as a cis white male, I do not want to take over and above Shada or the lovely Donna, who, it's nice to see you, Donna. I didn't know you was on the call, so lovely to see you as well. So I'm happy for them guys to go before me. So.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Simon.
Shada,
I just like to, thank you so much for the organizing team for this beautiful session. I'm learning a lot on microaggressive, right? For me, microaggressive takes place within the family a lot, right? And if I can learn to deal with in my family, I'm able to deal outside in the workplace. And the only way, I'll take my family example, right? In our family, if something is wrong with someone, straight away it will go on WhatsApp and we try to deal with it. And this is how everyone is different, remember, right? So we find the right spot and then say it straight away. We don't keep it in our heart. It's not good to keep anything in the heart. As Simon, sometimes I meet up with Simon, and if something is wrong with me and Simon, straight away on the phone, and we clear the air. This is our workplace as well, So that's what I understood. It's so beautiful, beautiful session. I'm so happy to join the afternoon session. If you have time, can you please cover a little bit about psychotherapy? That's also something very much coming out in force. Thank you very much.
Just before Donna, I just want to confirm that definitely Shada is somebody who will challenge any microaggression, and I've learned a lot from it. So I'm going to stop and let Donna.
Hiya, can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you.
I mean, I think people kind of think of things like microaggressions as being sort of like woke language, and you know, this is something that's all just really fashionable right now, and you know, it's from nowhere. But I think it's kind of interesting that, to me, I think if the UK has a constitution, it's the Magna Carta, and if you boil the Magna Carta down to 2 sentences, it's you can do what you want, but don't be a dick. And in essence, microaggressions are just being a dick. And to me, that means it's not woke. Since the beginning of our nation, our constitution has told us to not be a dick or to not use microaggressions. So I think it's really important that, you know, yes, I'm putting it in a comical way, but I think it is really important that this isn't new, this isn't woke, this isn't, you know, just fashionable right now. This is humanity. This is the direction that humanity has been traveling in since for thousands of years. And we should acknowledge that and start acting like, you know, this, I think there's sort of this liberal thing that, you know, it's something we should almost apologize for. No, this is the way, this has been the direction of travel for years, for millennia. And it's so important that we try and get it right now.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sharda and Donna. Very much echoing Jenny's clap there. I think, no, you've completely hit the nail on the head there. It is very much, it isn't a new thing at all. I think the term microaggressions in itself was coined in the 80s, I believe.
Yeah.
It's not a new term at all. And as Mark Fosbrook actually kind of concurs with you there, Donna, it's not woke or snowflake, it's that we are evolving as a society. We've become far more aware of each other's feelings, beliefs, and the impact each of us can have on one another. Absolutely. It's just that I think we're getting to a stage now where we have social media, we have a means of sharing different experiences, which is a beautiful thing, and we're becoming more aware of that. So absolutely. Simon, do you want to?
Please, otherwise I might burst. It's something that's very, very, very important to me. I've, as somebody who works for Birmingham City Council, as somebody who lives in the city, very proud. One of the big, and it's interesting because we've got somebody from the Villa. I'm going to talk about the Blues. I'm not a Blues fan. I'm a Leicester fan. So you know, but there's a real microaggression that continuously goes on around that football club. I'm from the Romany community. And that's a really important and marginalised community that faces microaggressions, open racism, etc., etc. 2 weeks ago, I found that the Commonwealth Games had shared a story of the gypsy curse on the Blues ground. It is 2021. Why are we still talking about, you know, a gypsy curse, you know, etc.? So they exist. The problem is that this is a bigger, and I think what the microaggression does is it's the end result. It's the smaller end of institutional racism. And that's the problem. The problem is that we have a society where, again, there's this kind of almost like common sense idea. We're too full up. We can't have anybody else come in until we need trucks to drive for Christmas, etc., etc. You know, the institutional racism, sexism, just that institutional discrimination means that for some people, they also sit in a privileged position. And that's why I just looked in and thought, actually, and is that a microaggression in one level? As a cis white male, I thought actually 2 women of colour wanted to speak. Is that right for me to do or not? You know, and I thought, yes, so I'm going to do it. So if it is a microaggression, I would love to learn. But for me, having that intersectionality kind of approach, and again, it's a new word, but it's not. It goes all the way back to, you know, Marion Tubman and others way back in the day, is understanding that because of that privilege, that actually the challenge in itself can be problematic. So as a white man, you know, and as an anti-racist and an anti-sexist, a feminist, etc., how I actually challenge when I see that can sometimes be disempowering for the individual who's on the receiving end. So I think there's a learning that we need to do that means that, so a really great example that I think, and it's a really wonderful video, and there's lots of other things, is about somebody who is being, you know, either racially or sexually abused on a bus. And actually how you intervene in that was to go and strike up a conversation with the person that's a positive, and you ignore the perpetrator in many ways. It's very difficult for me. I'm quite a fiery person and tend to not go for the, I'm going to apologise that you've upset me, I'm going to tell you just how much you've upset me. But I think that's something, because what we don't want to do is, through our action, is disempower that person who we're trying to say, look, we're standing in solidarity with you. We're standing to support you. How can I empower you? And that's really difficult. So I'd be just interested in what people think around that, and is a way forward around that. And obviously the bigger issue is we've got to challenge that top end, not just challenge the bottom end of microaggression, but that institutional level that does exist. So starting with the blues ground and its stupid gypsy stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. I think I wasn't aware of that story around the news article, so that's quite shocking for me. But I do echo a lot of what you've said around, you know, the marginalisation of Romanis and that kind of demographic as well. It is quite shocking. Thank you everyone who has contributed. I will echo Mark's comment around, we apologise if anybody was offended by Donna's wording, but we do hope that you can understand like the passion and the actual meaning behind those words, because that in itself is still very true, and that holds true regardless of how we do say that. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I do want to say a massive thank you to everybody who's contributed, all the comments in the chat as well. I have a lot to take away myself. I've jotted down a lot of notes and a lot of reflections for me. So thank you so much. It's been such a learning curve for me as well. And I do hope that you've kind of learned something from this, and I'd be more than happy to have a further conversation, further chats around this. It's just unfortunate that we have run out of time. So in that case, I will hand it back to Darren. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lisa, for bringing up an incredibly important topic, and I guess this could have carried on for another hour, and we wouldn't even touch the surface. So I just want to remind you all of the focus of today is about uniting the region. So after the break, we're going to be going into groups of citizens and organisations, and they're going to be based around localities. So please make your way to those breakout rooms once they come up on your screen, and then when we start back again at 3 o'clock, we will continue the session. Okay, then, well, thanks, welcome back. I hope that was a really thought-provoking breakout session for you all, and that you've got something really valuable for it. And a big thanks to all of the facilitators, Nicola, Amy, Simon, and Harry, and also Lejana. So sorry if I missed anyone out there. And we are going to be going on to our kind of final section now, as we are moving towards the close of our wonderful conference that we've had so far. And when I was a kid, I was at school, and there was a really famous book by George Orwell, which I read, and it was called Animal Farm. And there was this really important line in it where he basically wrote that we're all equal, but some are more equal than others. And I think this next story that we're about to talk about brings that point entirely. We've all experienced COVID over the past 18 months, but evidently some people have been impacted more than others. And so I'm going to invite someone to share their experience of COVID and how it's impacted their life. And it's someone that you heard a little bit before in one of the Q&As. So can I welcome you, Donna Daly? Are you on?
Hi. Oh yeah, can you hear me?
I can. Beautiful. And I know Mark's going to join in as well with a couple of questions on the conversation if needed. But I'm going to start with you actually, Donna, and just ask you what your life was like before COVID, maybe.
Before COVID, and that's God, it feels like another time, doesn't it? It's like the before times. I was quite active within sort of groups such as I'm in another group called the Citizens Panel as well, which is quite a confusing thing because I end up being part of two groups which are called very similar names. But I was very involved in trying to make a difference. I guess that's always what's been important to me, is to try and make the world a better place, I guess, in a small way. I think I'm still trying to do that, but it's been made far more difficult with COVID.
And maybe Mark, at this point, it's useful for you to share with us how you met Donna and what kind of situation she was in at that point.
Yeah, so I came along to the other group that Donna was talking about, actually, and just to talk about Include Me and what we were trying to do across the region. And it was fair to say that Donna joined us late and had quite a bad day, I suppose is the easiest way of putting it, and was not in the best position from that day, but shared her story with us and shared the journey that has taken place over the last 18 months. And to be honest, since then, it's just absolutely stuck with me. And I know, Donna was feeling a bit unsure about sharing today, but also felt that actually it's not just Donna's position. There's an awful lot of people that are in that same situation. So as you sort of hear what Donna has to say, I think it's worth saying that, this isn't just an isolated occurrence for Donna, but it's an issue that a lot of people face. Donna, I suppose on that note, it's probably worth us starting to say is, over the last 18 months, how many times have you got out of your flat?
Once for 20 minutes.
Once for 20 minutes in the last 18 months?
In the last 18 months.
And I don't know how many other people on the call have not been outside their flat or house less than once in 20 minutes, but for me that's just heartbreaking. But I know, obviously, Donna, you've managed to chat using technology, which is obviously fantastic. But tell us a little bit about some of that interaction offline, so with your carers and things, and the situation you faced there.
Well, through COVID lockdown, I should say, my care became patchy, very patchy. There was often times where I was only receiving one call a day, and I normally received two. I wasn't getting things I needed done. However, I tried to work with my care provider because I knew things were difficult for them as well. Recruiting was very difficult. Keeping the staff that they already had was very difficult. And I also kind of wanted to keep, because really my carers are the only people that I saw on a regular basis. So I wanted to keep some, I'm trying to think of the word, consistency in my life. So, that I'd see somebody that I knew at least once a day. But a few months ago now, my care company at the time decided that they would no longer be able to support me, and gave me a month to try and find a new provider, which of course now meant that literally everyone that I had been seeing over the last 18 months, considering that I also hadn't been out in the last 18 months, was literally, yeah, you have to just say goodbye to them all and move on to a new provider, which of course left me feeling very vulnerable, not quite knowing what I was going to do.
Donna, obviously, if you had that care, how come you didn't go out? Could they not take you out?
One, at the time, as I said, the care was very patchy anyway, so it was literally making sure that I was washed, dressed, and ate in essence. So no, there really wasn't any extra. I mean, they weren't achieving what they should have within my plan anyway, but there certainly wasn't any extra scope for doing things like going out. That also isn't, I mean, I'm in the process of changing that, but that's not actually within the scope of my care plan. My care plan literally is about making sure that I stay alive. I know that sounds quite dramatic, but it literally is. It's about making sure that I eat, that I'm washed, that my house is clean. There is no sort of scope for socialisation or just going out, just going down to the park or just doing anything is not within my care plan at all.
I think you're talking about the difference between quantity of life, how long we live, and the quality of life, what we get to do. So staying in your house and not having any interaction, any physical interaction with people we know, from everybody else's experience of lockdown has been particularly impactful on people's mental health. So we realize that's a really important. So how can you change that? So is there anything you can do to encourage your care providers to, we wouldn't even say go the extra mile really, how can we make sure that you do get out more? Is there anything that can be done?
Well, I mean, at the moment I am in the process of trying to get my care package adapted so that it will have scope for being human rather than just being alive. I'm trying to think of a better way of putting that, but it's the only way that comes to mind at the moment.
You summed it up really well. In terms of all the activities, all the online virtual activities that people put on for people to be able to do from home, were you able to participate in any of those? Were any of those of any help to you?
Yeah, I think like with certainly some of the groups that I've been involved with, which have all sort of been moved virtually, I think that's probably the only reason I stayed somewhat sane, to be, because it was my only sort of contact with the outside world. I don't want to get too depressed about that, but yeah, it's
it's difficult, isn't it, Donna? I know how you're feeling that, that isolation, that the connection you've made has been really strong, and I know there are a couple of people on the call that you've obviously engaged with and connected with over the time, and I'm sure they're equally as relieved to see that you're still able to share and engage, and it's so, I don't know, you're, as I said to you the other day, Donna, you're constantly in my thoughts. On really, when you sort of told me you hadn't left the house, I just wanted to jump in my car, drive to Birmingham and take you out for a drink. But I know, some of the other things you shared with us as well is this transition that you've now got to a new care provider, and the fact that you're now having, what is potentially, although professional, strangers coming into your home. And did you want to tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and hopefully this isn't too much, but, in essence, I receive personal care, which means that literally I will have somebody wash me. And, I think people do think of that as just sort of being washing your face and washing your hands, but the rest of your body kind of needs washing too. So I will literally have people who I met 2 minutes before see me naked. And it's sort of like, I have the same boundaries that other people have. And it's sort of, I don't want to use the word degrading, but it can be humiliating. And you feel very vulnerable. And I've got quite good at putting my brain in another place and sort of, but it's not good. And especially when it's not so bad when you've got to know somebody. In fact, it's fine once you've got to know somebody, but when it's a new company, that's new people, and I think sometimes, and you think that they would, but they don't understand that. I think they assume that as long as they send somebody, it's okay, and having the continuity of having the same people is really important, because it is, and I don't want to cast aspersions on the carers. I know they're that they're professionals and they're responsible, and I don't want to in any way suggest that they're not. But it is still somebody coming into my home, into the place where I'm supposed to feel safe. And it makes you feel vulnerable. I'm probably just gonna leave it.
I think, Donna, it's just, hopefully other people are listening to this, and it's bringing home the real human element that sometimes organizations forget about. We get so caught up in saying, oh, we're going to arrange this, we're going to do this, we're going to organize this, we're just covering care for someone, and we forget that the person that we're developing these offers for, these services for, supporting with care, are all human beings and all have a valid and human worth and value and response. And that, I think this, in the comment, it's we all want to live, just not exist. And it's how we use that human nature. And as I said sort of earlier on in the support session this morning, where we spoke about the storytelling cycle, it's about listening to these sorts of stories. And and I'm so grateful that you've shared with us today, because I think it's really hammered home some of the thoughts that we probably wouldn't have even considered. I knew people were saying, yes, we know these people are saying that they're isolated. We know people are struggling during the pandemic. And I know, as a disabled individual, I've been very fortunate Yes, I was ill with COVID early on, but I've been able to get out of the house and do things. And I know that I'm in that very privileged position. And even though I think, oh yeah, there are people isolated, until you hear this fantastic story, which I say fantastic, it's heartbreaking to hear, but it's so important for everyone to listen to, that we don't think about those individuals in that real human way. And yeah, you know, to think of, you know, meeting a stranger and having to get naked to have then, you know, my care needs met, but then also the, you know, not being out of the house for more than 20 minutes in the last 18 months are all things that when you go away as supporters and citizens, that we need to keep in the forefront of our mind.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Donna, as well. There's no words that I can add to better what's already been said. I would suggest you go and check in the chat and just see some of the comments that people have already been writing, and how appreciative and empathetic people are towards your experiences. You know, the courage that you've shown in sharing something which is so very vulnerable, and I think we all wish you a much happier and brighter future going forward. So I really want to thank you for your contribution today. And we are coming to the end. We've got a few minutes left, and I suppose the big question now is, what's next? Yes, sorry that we won't have time for any more questions, but we do want this conversation to carry on in some form or another. So if you are a citizen or an individual and you want to be part of one of the sort of citizens networks, we really want to hear your thoughts and your views as many disabled people as possible, really. You know, we can't help make this region better without you. So it's really important that, you know, you get involved and have your say. If you're already an Include Me supporter, then to make sure that you're using those improvements, that you focus on some of the storytelling cycles we talked about, and think how you can bring storytelling into launch some of those. And obviously, if you're not yet a supporter, then there's still time to sign up. There's no deadline on that. So if you're not a supporter yet, then please sign up. And again, there's a questionnaire. I don't know if we've emailed it this time, but there's a link in the chat, and we'd really love you to fill in the feedback. There are just 3 questions on there. I'm going to rephrase a phrase which the Vice President Kamala Harris once said, which was, this may be the first, but hopefully it won't be the last. Yes, this is National Inclusion Week, but we don't want the focus just to be in this particular week. We need this conversation to continue after the end of the week and going forward. So really want to make sure that we keep that conversation going. And finally, I just want to say a few thank yous. Thank you to all the contributors today, all of those that have spoken and contributed so eloquently and so courageously. I also want to thank the lovely tech people here that have helped in the background, Matt and Liv and Kirsty earlier. And finally, I just want to thank all of you guys for attending and wanting to make this region a much better place. And as we would say, unite the region. So I hope it's been a really worthwhile, valuable conference for you. It's been a first for us, but hopefully it's been a worthwhile event, and I hope to hear from you all soon. And goodbye from me, Darren Harris. Thanks.
And also just a massive